Hey friend, welcome back. This is part 6 of The Space Between, a 15-part YouTube series in which we're exploring the space between the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Last week, we talked about Judea during the reign of the Seleucids, in which there was this huge increase in Hellenization, or in Greekification, if you will, in which the Greekified Jews were gaining a whole lot of control and influence culturally, politically, religiously. And this is when Antiochus IV, or also as he called himself, Antiochus Epiphanes, or God made manifest. He became king, and after getting his tail whipped down in Egypt, came up and let it all out on Jerusalem, in which he conquered the city and he burned down half of it, and he outlawed the practice of the Jewish indigenous religion and made it illegal to worship Yahweh, and turned the temple into a temple to Zeus. He sacrificed pigs on the altar of all of the unclean animals he could have chosen. He chose pigs, probably not accidentally, and outlawed the worship of Yahweh, which was unheard of in the ancient world. And that's when our story picks up today, in a small rural town about 35 miles northwest of Jerusalem called Modain. And in that town, there was an elderly priest named Mattathias. And this elderly priest was given the task of making the very first sacrifice to the Greek gods. And when given that opportunity, he refused. And in fact, he refused so hard that when another elder in the community came forward to make the sacrifice, he killed him. And then he killed the Greek soldier who had come to enforce the sacrifice. And then when an obvious warrant for his arrest was put out, he and his 5 sons fled into the wilderness to figure out what was next, because nothing would ever be the same again for them or for anyone. This feels very similar to when Moses killed the slave driver in Egypt and then had to flee into the wilderness. And actually, the parallels are probably not accidental either. So in 167, Mattathias and his sons out in the wilderness organized a small band of militants to take back their land from the Seleucids and from the Hellenized Greeks. The books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees describe all of what's going to happen next with the war and the revolt and all of that in explicit detail. So if you would like to learn more about it, just check those books out. There's also a whole bunch of ancient historians who have talked about it. I'm not going to get into too much detail because we could spend 2 months just going through all of the different battles and the skirmishes and the back and forth and the back and forth. And we don't have time for that. And I'm not really interested in teaching you that today. I instead want to look at some of the broader themes of what's happening here culturally, as well as politically and historically. So Mattathias and his 5 sons, they were driven by this intense sense of religious zeal that was also driven by this increasingly stratified society in which the rural folks tended to cling more towards the indigenous religion and also were left out of this new economy. And the urban folks tended towards this kind of syncretism with the Greek philosophy and science and culture and the worship of the gods and kind of blending it and mixing it together into this thing we call Hellenism. And so he and his sons started going through the countryside and finding all of these disenfranchised folks out in the countryside and started organizing them into a kind of guerrilla militia. And when he died a year later, his son Judah took over and earned the nickname Maccabee, which 1st and 2nd Maccabees, this is where it comes from. Judah Maccabee, which literally means the hammer. He's Judah the hammer. And we're not sure if it's because he just absolutely destroyed everything he came in contact with, or he fought with a hammer. Either one is possible because he's not a soldier. He's just a peasant who is rising up against their oppressive overlords. And these people, they were this small band of mostly rural men, and they were up against one of the finest armies in the entire world. I mean, the Seleucids, they fought with these deadly phalanxes in which they had these like 18-foot spears and huge shields that all joined together. So it was like fighting a tortoise and you couldn't get through. They had archers and slingers. They had heavily armed cavalry and war elephants. How are you going to go up against a war elephant? So obviously, if they tried to gather troops and go up against them, they were going to lose. They would lose in 10 minutes. So they used their knowledge of the land to their advantage. They attacked by night. They attacked in small bands. They disrupted trade routes. They would go into cities and they would topple all of the idols. They would kill all of the Hellenized Jews, which they viewed as traitors and just as bad as the Greeks, if not worse. And so their whole mission was not necessarily to defeat them in open battle, but to convince the Seleucids that this was going to be too expensive and annoying to maintain a presence in Judea, and so we'll leave them alone. Think kind of like, honestly, like modern insurgency groups. You know, the Taliban uses the same kind of warfare today. The American revolutionaries in the 1700s used this kind of warfare today. This exact same justification for the way that they fought against a much greater enemy. So 2 years into the conflict, Judah Maccabee took Jerusalem, which is kind of a big deal. That's the center of Judea. All except for the highest citadel that Antiochus had built, which was still full of Hellenized Jews and a garrison of soldiers. They couldn't take that, but they took the rest of the city, including the temple. And they went into the temple and they found that it was left in ruins and it was desecrated and there were idols everywhere. And so they went through this process of cleansing the temple, of throwing everything out that was not of God. Even the altar itself, they destroyed and they put away. For maybe one day a priest might be able to sanctify it. They brought in a new altar made out of unhewn stone. And after they had gone through everything, they discovered that they only had enough oil in one small container to last one day. And the process of ritual purification takes much longer than one day, but they decided to light the menorah instead. Just burn what we can. And that one jar lasted for 8 days, long enough for them to procure more ritually pure oil that they could keep the fire going that would never go out again. And after this ceremony of cleansing the temple and bringing the presence of God back into God's house, Judah Maccabee stood up in front of the people and he said, "Every year we will celebrate this day with 8 days of celebration, to remember when the temple was purified and sanctified and God came back to live amongst God's people." And of course, you know that today as Hanukkah, which Jesus also celebrated, by the way. Yeah. So that wasn't the end, obviously. That was only 2 years in. War kept raging on for the next couple of years as the Maccabees would take a little bit more land and the Seleucids would take it back, and the Maccabees would take this land and the Seleucids would take it back over here. It was just back and forth and back and forth. And then in 161, Judas Maccabee managed to sign treaties with Rome and Sparta. Treaties of friendship that said that they would aid each other mutually, which then, made the Seleucids think twice about ransacking Israel because they really didn't want to anger Rome. Rome was this republic that was starting to gain power and prominence, and they knew that they couldn't beat Rome. I think the Jewish people would come to regret getting in bed with Rome, but let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. So that year that he signed that treaty, he also died. Which, happens to the best of us. And so his son, Jonathan took over. And Jonathan, in addition to being made the leader of the people, was also made the high priest. And this is kind of a big deal for a couple of reasons. If you'll remember from last week, the high priesthood had been bought and sold several times, people bribing Antiochus to let them become high priest. And so the office of high priest had already kind of started to crumble a little bit. But this was a bigger deal because, you see, from the time of Solomon until that day, one family, the sons of Zadok, had been high priests. So for 1,000 years, there had been one family of priests that had resided over the temple. And though Jonathan was in the Levite tribe, he was in priestly tribe, he was not in the high priest's family. And so this was a big break. Plus, he was a warrior with blood on his hands. Also, he was the political leader of the people. And mixing religion and politics can get a little dicey sometimes. But desperate times, desperate measures. He seems a good guy to do both, so he went for it. And he ruled for 19 years with relative peace. They're still warring with Seleucids. They're still not technically independent. There's still skirmishes all over the place. And then he gets killed. Mattathias' sons do not have very good luck. They all get killed one way or another. And so his brother Simon took over and also became the high priest in 142. You see, we're setting up a precedent here where the leader of the people also becomes the high priest, something that had never been done before. There'd always been a separation of the two offices in Judah. This might become a problem. We'll find out soon. So his brother Simon, through a combination of military might and shrewd political maneuvers, finally managed to officially become acknowledged as a free and sovereign nation in 141 BC, which Rome then ratified in 138, a few years later. And if Rome acknowledges you as an independent nation, then you are an independent nation as far as that time and place was concerned. Now keep in mind, this is 138 BC. This is 138 years before the birth of Christ. So we're talking about the difference between then and Jesus is like the difference between, what would that be? The 1890s and today? 1880s, 1890s? Math on the fly. That's not that long ago. That's like Reconstruction era. That's like turn of the century. We're about to get into the Wright brothers if we're trying to compare the two. So this is not ancient history to Jesus. This is still very much in the collective imagination and in the stories and in the minds of the people of the first century Judea that we meet in the New Testament. And this, for the very first time since Nebuchadnezzar, 450 years earlier, Jerusalem and its surrounding territory were finally ruled again by the Jews. What a wild ride this has been. Let's recap real quick. So, while Judah flipped between the Greek empires of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, Greek culture became more and more a part of everyday life. From the Greek Bible in Alexandria to the Greek gymnasium in Jerusalem, more and more people were abandoning their indigenous religion in favor of the new and exciting Hellenistic philosophy and religion. And this was especially true of urban Jews, who, as opposed to the rural Jews, who were more isolated and avoided outside influence. And this all came to a head under Antiochus Epiphanes, who outlawed the indigenous Jewish religion and converted the temple in Jerusalem to a temple to Zeus. That's when Mattathias and his 5 sons organized a guerrilla rebellion to wipe out idol worship, Greek troops, and any Hellenized Jews that stood in their way. And 26 years later of violent and bloody, some might say terrorist warfare, Simon officially was named high priest and king of Judea. He defeated and expelled the final garrison of troops in Jerusalem and was heralded in the streets with singing and praise and the laying down of palm branches as their Messiah and Savior. And now there are a couple of themes that have come up in this story and that I think are important to note. One, remaining faithful in the face of apostasy. So no matter how many people are doing the wrong thing, don't you do it. a seemingly cataclysmic, world-ending attack from foreign enemies, and an improbable victory for the faithful few. Those three themes will become very important in this new and up-and-coming genre of literature that we call Second Temple Apocalyptic Jewish literature, or just apocalyptic literature, or just apocalypses. Like, for example, in the New Testament, a couple hundred years later, we have the Apocalypse of John, or just the book of Revelation. That's a good example of Christian apocalypse. There's dozens that we have from Jewish apocalypticism, and probably hundreds more that we don't have. And these works, which start to crop up in this time, they use a lot of the same language that the prophets from exile that we talked about a couple of weeks ago used, but it's subtly different. Here's what I mean. They take that language and they amplify it up like crazy. So if you read through Daniel or Revelation or some of these other apocalypses, you'll read about dragons and beasts and flames and locusts with swords and just really over-the-top dramatic language, the kinds of things that you'd see airbrushed onto the side of a van or something. And they did that because they can't come out and say what they really want to say. Right? Like, if you were in that time period, you couldn't just write, Antiochus Epiphanes is literally the worst, and God is going to kill him. Like, no, you can't write that. You will be exiled and killed. You could write that there is a beast that will set himself up in the temple, and he will put forth the abomination of desolation and persecute the people, and then the skies will open and the stars will fall, and the Lord will come down on a white horse, and he shall remove a sword, and the beast from the east, and the iron golem from the south, and you can talk in that kind of language, and the Greeks won't know what you're talking about. So it's kind of a way for an oppressed people to express themselves without getting caught. It's also a way of making really vivid imagery that evokes emotion instead of fact. For example, in the book of Daniel, chapters 9, 11, and 12, he talks about a foreign king who will abolish daily sacrifice and set up the abomination of desolation in the temple before persecuting people. And now everyone at the time would have known that that's Antiochus Epiphanes, right? I mean, he's from the north. He fits all the descriptions. But then in the next chapter, the angels come and they kill him. And God comes and his kingdom comes down and they are saved and God reigns forever and ever and ever. And so they could see Antiochus in that, but they could also see that God saves them. And they can find comfort in that. Yeah. And so that's the point of apocalyptic literature. It's all about opening up the curtain between heaven and earth to reveal that no matter how bad things are today, and even when they seem like they're at the worst they could possibly get and the world is about to end, God always wins. Apocalypse, it means unveiling. It means revealing. It means to open up and to look and to show you something that was hidden. Apocalypse is not a bad thing. Well, it is for some people, but not for God's people. And this is what Jesus is doing in Matthew 24, which is our scripture reading for this week. He says in the Common English Bible, when you see the disgusting and destructive thing that Daniel talked about standing in the holy place, the reader should understand this, then those in Judea must escape to the mountains. See, Jesus isn't saying that Antiochus Epiphanes is coming back from the dead to literally repeat history, but history does repeat. Right? We've seen history repeat all the time, both in the sense that terrible things will happen again and will then happen again, and also in the sense that God will rescue God's people again and again and again and again. In this case, Jesus meant that the Romans would come in and desecrate the temple. But that in the end of the chapter, God still prevails. That part's really important in apocalyptic literature. It never ends with God's people being destroyed. It always ends with God's people being saved. And this fantastical imagery that we read in there is so wonderfully vague. So you can apply it to almost any time and place. And people have. You know how many people throughout time have used Revelation to predict that they are currently living in the end of the world? I mean, read through Revelation and then look at 2020 and you'll say, it kind of does feel like the end of the world. And, you know, my social media feeds are full of this kind of stuff. But it's not any more than the Cold War was the end, or the bubonic plague was the end, or any number of horrible things was the end. Because that's the point. The apocalyptic literature that starts to come out of this time period is like a green screen, and you can stand in front of it and you can put yourself into the story so that you can feel that other folks have been in the end of the world before, and God had saved them before, and so God will save me this time. So that your experience is validated, and it gives you a chance to remember God's faithfulness. So I really love this genre. I do. And this is what I did my senior thesis on in undergrad. And it will come up a lot. This is just starting to develop in this time period. And you can see kind of the historical reasons why it's starting to develop. But it's going to take on a life of its own in the next 100 years or so as the messianic hopes of the people start to rise when they realize that the Hasmonean kings in Jerusalem are really not that great. And there's a lot of political infighting between the fact that the king is also the high priest, and Rome gets involved, and they're not exactly the benevolent friend that they seemed like before. And we start to realize that history is about to repeat itself within one generation. And oh my goodness, we just need a savior. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This sort of writing also shows up a lot in the writings of a certain separatist movement that we know of at least one group in Qumran around the Dead Sea who just so happened to leave a whole lot of scrolls that were perfectly preserved that we discovered a few years ago. And so we'll see starting next week what the Dead Sea Scrolls, what the rise of the Sadducees and the Pharisees can teach us about this era, and just what happens to a people when your religious and political leader is the same person. So I'll see you next week.